So we're back here. This is the second part of the lecture on the Ricardian model. This is chapter 2, I believe, from your text. In the previous video, we covered the assumptions of the Ricardian model, as well as some history. We talked about, then we started plugging some numbers into that model, given those assumptions. You should have at this point in your notes production possibilities frontiers for the home country and the foreign country. And from those you should be able to get the opportunity costs of production for either good in either country, right? So you should have essentially 4 opportunity costs at this point, 2 for home and 2 for foreign. Now those 2 opportunity costs for each nation are the reciprocals of each other because we only have 2 goods. Yes, that's my cat. Hang on here. Let's see if we can make it do that. All right, he's happy now. He's up in the window. Okay, so that's where you should be at this point. Now, those different opportunity costs that you've calculated, or that are in the previous slides, are the basis for trade in the Ricardian model. So trade is possible because the 2 countries are different. How are they different? They have different opportunity costs. Why do they have different opportunity costs? Because they have different labor productivities. Okay. Now, as I talked about at some length last time, this is a one factor of production model, labor, right? So you could talk about a Ricardian model with multiple factors of production, and then of course the basis would the basis for trade would be attributable to one or any combination of the productivity of the factors of production. Lesson in the Ricardian model, well, the first lesson, trade arises from differences between nations, and those differences arise from different productivities. All right. So we have the pre-trade conditions. Now let's talk about, there we go. Let's talk about the basis for trade in the Ricardian model. So part 2. Okay, now using the numbers that we've talked about previously, right? So there are earlier slides. So if if they aren't written down in your notebook now ahead of this, please go back, have a look at that video, write them down, okay, and do the calculations. And so what I have here, right there, okay, is just a quick 2x2 matrix that shows you the opportunity cost of producing items A and B in the home country and the foreign country. So I've got 4 costs, right? And of course we'll notice that the cost of item A in the home country is the reciprocal of the cost of item B. It has to be, okay? So 1/2 versus 2/1, right? So every time we produce an item A, we give up half of item B, and every time we produce an item B, we give up 2 of item A, okay? Right, which is just 2 ways of stating the same thing. All right, so comparing those, we can see that the cost of producing item A in terms of item B, remember everything's relative for reasons that we talked about again last time. Make sure you have those foundations down. If you don't, now is a good time to go back and watch that first video a second time. All right. But looking at item A, we can see that the cost in terms of item B is lower in the foreign country. And similarly, we can find that the cost of producing item B is lower in the home country. Again, both in terms of the other thing. So we would say, because the foreign country gives up less when it produces item A, we would say it has a comparative advantage in that. Okay, what does its comparative advantage mean? It's just a fancy way of saying they can produce at a lower opportunity cost. In other words, they can give up less to give and get excuse me, wow, tongue-tied today. They give up less to produce a given quantity of that thing, right? Okay, so you can think of a lot of things that way. Like, how much do you give up to do this? Like, you might ask yourself, well, should I change the oil on my car, or should I, take it into the oil change place? Well, let's say it takes me an hour to change my own oil, right? And I can work being an economist for, let's say, $80 an hour. Well, if it costs me $100 to get my oil change, well, then I should do it myself, right? because what am I going to give up? 1 hour of working as an economist for $80. Clearly, I give up more by having somebody else do it. If, on the other hand, the oil change only costs $30, then clearly I should change my own oil. Or sorry, excuse me, I should not change my own oil because, in the hour that it takes me to change it, I would have given up $80 worth of time to be an economist. So this doesn't make any sense for me to change my own oil. This is the idea of opportunity cost, right? And it's also the idea of comparative advantage. So if I have maybe a low-paying job, maybe $8 an hour, and it takes me an hour to change my oil, and oil changes cost $30, now I should change my own oil because I'm giving up an hour of my time, which is worth $8 to change the oil, okay? And if I have somebody else do it, it costs $30. Now, some of you are saying, yeah, but you got to buy the oil and the filter. Yeah, I know I'm sort of simplifying that out, but regardless, the basic conditions, hold, right? The example remains sound. Okay. So what Ricardo's argument was that if nations produced goods and services that are relatively low opportunity costs, that is to say, if nations produce in areas for which they have a comparative advantage and then export, first of all, every nation has a comparative advantage in something. Okay, and that just follows from the analysis, right? So from here, for these ones here, right? These are reciprocals, right? So it doesn't matter if we have n number of nations, as long as we have n number of goods, right? Each one of those nations is going to have the lowest opportunity cost in one of those n number of goods, and therefore then they can export that item and end up better off than they were otherwise. Now, some of you might say, well, wait a second here. What? Remember, comparative advantage is about opportunity cost. It's not what we call absolute advantage. If you go back to the numbers from the last slide, we see that actually, both nations, if I remember correctly, it's item B, both nations are just as effective at producing item B. In absolute terms, nobody's any more productive than anybody else. Right? So we could say that in this case, the home country, we can see by the numbers, the home country is essentially as good or better at producing everything when compared to the foreign country. Yet, because of this idea of opportunity cost, the foreign country ends up having these advantages. Well, why is that? Can we think of an example of that? You might think about, yourself, and maybe if you have a little brother or little sister, and maybe you have to split up tasks. Your parents have asked you to do some chores or something, and you're better at all the chores than the little brother or sister probably. It's just the way it goes, right? And if you're the little brother or sister, probably the older brother is better at all the chores maybe than you are. Okay, but there's some things that the littler kids maybe are relatively not as bad at. So for example, let's say we have two chores, right? One is maybe like putting away glass dishes, ceramic dishes, and the other one is cleaning up Legos on the ground or building blocks on the ground. Well, probably, the older brother or sister can do both those jobs faster. But when we think about what each gives up, well, in terms of the plates, probably a lot is given up if we give that task to the younger sibling. First of all, they probably can't reach up to get the plates in there. And second of all, they're probably going to get a lot of them broken. So they're going to give up a lot when they do that, right? They're going to give up a lot. Whereas the older brother or sister gives up probably a smaller amount of time and also less breakage. And then when we move over to the other thing, Legos, probably those two kids probably the older kid can probably put away those Legos a little more quickly, but it's probably a lot closer, right? It's probably a lot closer between the two. Legos are pretty hard to break. They can be scooped up pretty easily and put away. And so in terms of what they're giving up, right, the littler kid actually ends up giving up less because their time is less valuable when compared to the older child. And so we end up with a comparative advantage for both, right? Each one gets a task that they have comparative advantage. And we'll find that that's always the case, right? We'll find that's always the case. N number of nations, N number of goods. It's always, the math is always going to work out that way. Trade can always be a net sum gain under these Ricardian conditions. And that's the second and by far the most important lesson of the Ricardian model. That is, that as long as we have differences in something as simple as labor productivity, and as long as we have N number of goods and N number of nations, then all nations can benefit from trade regardless of how bad they are at basically everything, right? So even if they're smaller, poorer natural resources, less education, less labor productivity in general, there's still going to be tasks that they have the lowest opportunity cost for when compared to other nations. And that's what the Ricardian model teaches us, right? My cat is sitting here on my lap. See, yeah. So he's decided this is a good place to be right now. So he's getting an economics education. All right, so let's keep rolling. Okay, so this slide here, we're talking, this is Simon here. It's from a cartoon when I was a kid. You can Google Simon and drawing, you'll see the story. This is just a story of what I was just talking about. Okay. So continuing on, here's, I work out the math of this, right? So the lesson that I just told you, right, that any nation can benefit from trade, we can easily prove that. Right, we can easily prove that mathematically using the numbers that we've already generated from this, right? And indeed, you plug in any numbers. Try this through. If you're not convinced, take 3, 4, 5 sets of numbers, plug them in, run it. You're going to get the same sort of result. Okay. Now, we know that pre-trade, there's different prices in each country. What are those prices? They're right here. Okay, we talked about that in the last video, so I'm not going to go over that too much. But we know that after trade starts occurring, those prices are going to standardize across both nations, right? So home and foreign are going to have the same price of item A and the same price for item B. So it's going to be the price of item A in terms of item B and item B in terms of A, and it's going to be the same in both countries. Prices are going to equalize across these two nations. All right. So that implies that there's some negotiated terms of trade, right, that's common. So one starts out here, one starts out here, they work together and they get to a point. What is the range of prices that would be acceptable to both parties? Well, we can determine that as well. Okay. Looking at that first bullet point with numbers there, as long as the price of B is less than 3 A's or greater than 2 A's, that price of B is going to be agreeable to both nations. Why? What is the price of B in the home country? The price of B in the home country is 2 of A. That's the upper right hand box here in this thing. So if I'm in the home country before trade occurs, every item B I have, how much does it cost in terms of A? 2. Okay, why? Productivity, right? Right. In the foreign country, how much does every item of B cost? Costs 3A. Okay, so where's it more expensive? It's more expensive in the foreign country, right? Which one has a comparative advantage in item B? The home country. Right? They give up less. So who's going to produce item B? The home country. All right, so let's go back here. As long as the home country is getting more than 2A, it's happy to produce, right? In other words, the price, the global price, is higher than what it gets before trade. As long as that's the case, they're amped, right? They're going to be like, yes, that's good. We were getting, every time we produced an item B, we used to be getting 2 A's. Now we're going to get more than 2 A's. All right? And on the other end, what about the foreign country? Well, every time they produced an item B, they had to give them 3 A's. So if they can get, item B for less than 3 A's, they're going to be happy too. Right? So the maximum price for B is going to be 3 A's. And the minimum price that's going to be acceptable to everybody is going to be 2 A's. So as long as the price is somewhere between there, everybody's going to be cool with it. All right. Think about this in terms of numbers. Going back to the productivity quick. Let's say we've got 2 things, apples and oranges. And it takes us, we can produce 10 apples an hour or 20 oranges. The price of apples is going to be 2 oranges. Okay, for reasons that we talked about last time. And let's say we've got a neighbor that every time they produce an apple, they could have produced, or 10 apples, they could have produced 30 oranges. That price over there is going to be 3 oranges for an apple. So if I can produce apples, as long as I can produce apples for 2 oranges and trade with them, right? So I tell them, okay, well, geez, I'll make apples for you, but you got to give me, 2.5 oranges. That's a good deal for me because it's better and I can do it on my own. And it's also a good deal for them because, of course, they were paying 3 oranges before. Now they only have to pay 2.5. So they're going to give me 2.5 oranges for every apple I give them. That's cheaper than what they had before. Before they had to give up 3. It's more expensive than what I was getting for them before. Before I would only get 2 oranges for all of my apples. Okay, so this is how we can determine the range of prices is going to be agreeable to both parties in a Ricardian model, and it's going to be similar for all the other models. Now, the price of A in terms of B, right, is essentially the reciprocals with the whole thing flipped around, which amounts to the same thing. Okay, so here in this slide we talk about that a little bit. Why is that? Well, it's the same as the oil change story right before. If I can get my oil change for less than I can give up when I do it myself, I might as well do that, right? Might as well do that. Okay, so here I ask you to draw this out, right? So what I would like you to do is I would like you to redraw your 2 PPFs that you did before, or if you want to do the math, that's fine too, right? But you can redraw the 2 PPFs, and then you're going to have each nation produce only what they have a comparative advantage in, right? So they're going to be producing on one axis point, right? Either the x-axis or the y-axis, depending upon which nation and which good. And then you're going to draw a ratio that is somewhere between those 2 slopes. Okay? So I'll say that again. Let's say you have a PPF where on your y-axis, the y-axis intercept is 5 and your x-axis intercept is 10. Okay? Meaning that the slope of your PPF is -1/2. Okay? Which would be your local prices going this way, right? It's 2 to 1 going the other way, right? So if you flip the graph around like that, the slope would be -2, 10 and 5, right? Okay. So then you've got your other PPF. Let's say that one is, trying to remember what our ratios were before. Whatever. Let's say that the x-axis is 10 rather than 5. But that the y-axis is 10 rather than 5, and the x-axis is the same, right? So let's say that it's 10. Okay, so now you've got 10 and 10. So the slope is what? It's -1. Okay, so one PPF has a slope of -1/2. The other PPF has a slope of -1. So what ratios would be in between those two? Well, let's say -3/4 or -4/3, depending on which direction we're working from. Okay, so on our first PPF, we're going to end up with a line that is somewhat flatter than before. Of course, what was I talking about? Okay, draw both those out, right? And what you're going to find is you're going to find that the slopes are of course the same, right, when expressed in similar terms, and you're going to find that they are both outside, right, when they're expressed from the correct origin. Both those functions are wholly outside the pre-trade PPFs. Okay, in other words, those types of terms of trade, the terms of trade that we're laying out here, are going to produce what? Production and consumption possibilities that lie outside of where the country could have been without trade. Okay? Okay, so how is that possible? How is it that we end up with this net sum gain? Well, it's really it seems kind of complicated, but when we back off from it a little bit and we think in sort of plain terms, it actually becomes very straightforward. The gains are coming from the different costs, right? Each individual or each nation is producing at a lower cost than they could do so on their own. And so by pooling their resources and doing what they're best at, they're able to effectively lower the cost of everything. They're able to lower the cost of the thing that they're relatively good at producing relative to the thing that they're not that good at producing. And the other nation is the reverse. So they end up bringing down the costs on both of those, on both item A and both B. And by exchanging that, sharing that benefit, sharing that aggregated reduction in costs, they're both able to benefit from trade. In the same way that you're able to benefit from trade maybe when you go to the grocery store. So when you go to the grocery store, what are you doing? You're trading money that you earned at work. So you did some work that you were presumably good at. You received money, or relatively good at, I should say. You received cash or money. And then you use that cash to go buy groceries, which are things you're not relatively good at producing. Okay, right? If you're a really, really good farmer, you wouldn't go to work doing something else. You'd go to work being a farmer, right? And then you're going to produce the food, and you're going to sell that food and get cash, right? Which you're not relatively good at producing. Or get other things, maybe a car that you're not relatively good at producing. Right? So by specializing, focusing on what you're relatively good at, you're able to bring down the cost not just for yourself, but for everybody who consumes the goods and services that you produce. Okay? And that basic truth doesn't end when we get to international borders. Okay? And that lesson, that is the lesson of Ricardian trade model, right? Is that by producing things that are relatively low cost for us, and the word relative is of critical importance. By producing things that are relatively low cost for us, we can reduce the costs of effectively everything, and then by trading with others based upon our focus and specialization and low cost, we can share those benefits with the rest of the world, and they can do likewise with us. And in this way, we'll all end up being better off after trade than we were before. Just like you're better off after you get back from the grocery store than you were before you went. And how do you know that? Because you went, right? It was wholly voluntary. Nobody forced you to go to the grocery store. You could have said, forget it, I'm not going grocery shopping anymore. I'm going to grow plants in my backyard and farm cows or whatever. But you didn't. Right? So just the fact that you went and did that you went to work, got money, took the money, went to the grocery store to get groceries, right? It implies that was a superior choice for you. And it was also for the superior choice for the grocery store, right? The clerks at the grocery store, they could just ate that food themselves. Of course they didn't. Right? They sold it to you because they wanted the money more than they wanted the food. You wanted the food more than you wanted the money. Okay, so that's the lesson of Ricardo. Okay, so it's foundational, right? Foundational. Okay, so this is David Ricardo right here, right? One of his better pictures. There we see those lessons. Okay. All right, so make sure to sketch this out. I made a little video of me doing the sketching this out, graphing it out. It's not the best video. If I have a chance later this week, I'll put together a better one. But if not, that one's there, right? And you can certainly ask questions too. But it's really pretty straightforward to do. But if you have questions, please ask. All right, we'll see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Take care.